In the coming week, Chinese President Xi Jinping meets President Donald Trump. Egypt's President Sisi visits the United States. And two anniversaries are marked: the U.S. entry into World War I and the establishment of NATO. It's March 30th, 2017, and time for The World Next Week. I'm Robert McMahon.
And I'm Jim Lindsay. Bob, on April 6th, Chinese President Xi Jinping is set to meet with President Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. North Korea is likely to top the agenda for their discussions. Kim Jong-un's regime continues to push its nuclear program ahead. Regional security issues like the territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas and other topics like trade are also likely to be on the agenda. But how significant is this conversation between the leaders of the United States and China?
I think potentially hugely significant, Jim. It's in some ways taken on the character of a sort of object of fascination right now because of the campaign rhetoric of candidate Trump and how some of that has been dialed back.
Well, he said China was the enemy. He's accused China of raping the United States.
Absolutely.
Strong words.
He did, and he promised to slap a 45% tariff on Chinese goods.
Have we done so yet?
We have not. He promised to declare China a currency manipulator on day one.
Did he do that?
No, he has not. He also took a phone call from a Taiwanese leader, President Tsai Ing-wen, and that was a break in protocol. It upset the Chinese quite a bit.
We seem to question the one China policy.
China policy. But in fact, he also got on a telephone call not too long afterwards and
back in February,
and reaffirmed that the U.S. would be pursuing the one China policy, which, among other things, recognizes mainland China as the one China that the U.S. would recognize, while the U.S. still continues other relations with Taiwan. That's sort of what's led up to this summit, but there's so many things, as you alluded to in the intro, Jim. North Korea is a looming huge issue. President Trump, as did candidate Trump, has talked a lot about what China could do to make that situation better.
Should do, not just could, but should do.
I mean, at one point, I think even as president had said, China can make this change, China can make this go away, he effectively said. I think he'll get sort of a more intense briefing about what China thinks it can do and why it's concerned perhaps that it's not going to act with such alacrity.
Well, President Trump clearly has a long list of asks for President Xi. It's not clear that President Trump has a long list of gives that he can give to President Xi.
No, and I think what's interesting, as some pundits have pointed out, is there was years of painstaking effort to build up China into what was termed a stakeholder in the global system. Even the term stakeholder became an interesting one that had to be translated carefully into Mandarin and so forth. And now you have a situation where perhaps, and again, this is probably an exaggeration, where China is going to be looking to the U.S. And maybe preaching to the U.S. a little bit about being more of a stakeholder in the global system it helped build.
Well, obviously, one of the issues that Chinese may bring up is the issue of climate change.
Absolutely.
They signed on to the Paris Climate Accord back at the end of 2015. The Trump administration has not walked away from the Paris Climate Accord, but the decisions, the executive orders the President Trump issued over the last week on coal and a variety of other things will make it very, very hard for the United States to meet its emission reductions.
That's right. And so, China is acting out of a lot of issues, but there was some sense of two biggest carbon emitters getting together, creating common cause. This was something that sort of gave a real sort of lift to the global effort to try to deal with climate change and to try to cut down current carbon emissions by a certain amount. And by the year 2025, I think was the first benchmark. China has been, its major cities have been choking on smog. It has sort of front and center immediate issues it wants to deal with anyway. It has also moved aggressively into alternative energy and areas.
Maybe gaining the lead in those critical technologies, which will give it
Absolutely.
A leg up in economic competition going forward. I would even expect the Chinese to use this as a PR opportunity to tout their commitment to combating climate change and point to the bad Americans and use that as a leverage point to try to, again, fracture America's friendships and relations with other countries. I mean, there's a political, strategic dynamic here besides the economic and environmental aspect.
And we should mention, I think it's apparent if it wasn't already, the enormous stakes in the U.S.-China economic relationship. While China came up for criticism repeatedly on the campaign, I think the extent and the depth of this relationship is more apparent than ever to this administration. The choice to have the meeting in Mar-a-Lago is an important gesture. I think it's where the president has gone frequently in his young presidency.
Well, apparently the Chinese also asked for it. They did not really want to do a meeting at the White House. They wanted something less formal.
And let's remember there was the so-called Sunnyland Summit between President Xi and Obama, and this is something the Chinese prefer to do, this kind of more personal and sort of roll your sleeves up, get together on a personal level and talk through issues. So it's going to be an interesting early big power test of the president.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how it is that President Trump deals with President Xi in comparison to a number of his other meetings. Last week, the president met with the German chancellor, and by all accounts, during that meeting, he kept coming back to the notion that the Germans hadn't paid their fair share for NATO and had to pay up, and they somehow owed the United States money, which sort of fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what NATO is about. I think the interesting question is going to be, in his meetings with President Xi, do we see the same kind of president sort of pushing hard? Again, certainly on the economic front, President Trump has laid out some big asks of the Chinese, whether you're talking about currency, access to markets, copyright, intellectual property. And the question is the president going to be that insistent? He clearly, on the campaign trail, made a big deal. This is one of his major focal points. But I'll note that he also made NAFTA a major focal point, calling it one of the worst trade deals ever. But according to reports coming out in the papers
just today,
suggesting that for all of that Sturm all of that drama, the asks they're going to make of the Mexicans and the Canadians in terms of revising NAFTA are quite modest. And so it's an interesting question here about what it is. We've heard a lot of the rhetoric. Now when you're in government, you have to make choices. What are the actual requests? How big is that gap there? But beyond that, how do other countries read that? Do they see it as a sign of an administration that is sort of getting down to nuts and bolts and they can deal with, or do they take it as a sign of weakness that there's a lot of talk and the action doesn't measure up?
And I think another area to watch is how much is said publicly about the South China Sea, about the creation of these artificial reefs and areas where China is building a capacity and building a military infrastructure by all appearances.
Yeah, I think that's without a doubt. I mean, I think it is pretty clear the Chinese are essentially building fixed aircraft carriers in the South China Sea by building up on these atolls, these rocks, these barely submerged platforms.
And the U.S. has, it's projected a defense budget that is big and bold, and the idea of greatly expanding the U.S. Navy. There is some understanding, or at least a sense that part of that is to be able to project that Navy into places like South China Sea.
Yeah, but by the time you build those ships, you're talking a long lead time, 10 years, 15 years, given the rate of island building by the Chinese in the South China Sea. They will have built fortifications. They'll be able to supply them with hundreds of missiles, and it would make it very difficult for surface ships, certainly, to operate in that area without risk of being a target in themselves.
But in the interim, you've had the Defense Secretary, Secretary Mattis, his first big trip was to that region to reassure allies in the area. He's spoken about this issue. You also, though,
he was in Northeast Asia.
He was in Northeast Asia.
He wasn't in Southeast Asia. And that actually, if you want to look at one big difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, one departure with the Trump team is they've seemed to have spent relatively little time talking about Southeast Asia. There has been no major trip by the Secretary of Defense or the CIA Director or the Secretary of State.
I was just going to say, Secretary Tillerson's trip was also to the same area, focusing on Northeast Asia. And although during his confirmation hearings said some pretty strong things about South China Sea, didn't come up a lot in his visits in Beijing. And he was, I think he was called to task for adopting some of the Chinese language in the final communique that came out of that meeting. Yeah,
well, I think, if you look at it, it's clearly countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines are greatly interested in what kind of role the administration is going to stake out in Southeast Asia.
Australia as well?
Australia as well. And again, for the Obama administration, part of it was talking a bit more about the region, being there much more. It was sort of seen in the region as important to actually get senior officials to show up. But the other big part of it was TPP. That was going to be the economic pillar of the rebalance to Asia. And obviously the Trump people, President Trump first day scratched it. Now, I want to emphasize the Trump administration has been in office now for still less than, I guess now it's a little over 2 months, less than 3 months. We haven't got to the 100-day mark. So
70 or so days, yeah.
You can only go to visit so many capitals at any one time. But I do think you're probably likely to hear in the weeks to come from those various capitals complaining that, in essence, they're being ignored, and that being tied to the concern that they're being abandoned. I think that's something to keep an eye on. But, Bob, President Xi won't be the only world leader that President Trump meets with this week. On April 3rd, he's going to be meeting with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. They're going to be meeting at the White House. This will be President Sisi's first official visit to the United States since he came to power in 2014. How does the Egyptian government view relations with Washington now compared to when President Obama was in the Oval Office?
Well, I think the Egyptians are looking forward to a warmer set of relations. Recall, President Sisi was the first foreign leader to call President-elect Trump after his electoral victory. They had a previous meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting earlier in the fall. They've established sort of a common language in talking to each other about this relationship. And Egypt and the U.S. had gone through a cycle of somewhat fraught, initially promising and then fraught relations. Because remember, early in the Obama administration, he gave a big speech in Cairo, and he was sort of laying out his markers for how he viewed the Middle East. And he was notably distancing himself from sort of the President Bush focus on democratic reforms and sort of the democratic wave, and more about sort of establishing common cause in other ways. And soon after, he was confronted by the Arab Spring and the calls for Mubarak's ouster. He was ousted, and Egypt went through a period of electing a Muslim Brotherhood leader, ousted in a coup. Sisi came in. Relations were frosty, although we should note U.S. aid to Egypt has continued through that period. It's extensive, and that has prevailed. Egypt is now seen as, in some ways, both a stabilizing factor, but also sort of in some quarters, a less important factor in the Middle East, which is just roiling these days. But I should note, Jim, that this meeting will be in Washington, and it's not expected to be in Mar-a-Lago. And I think the Egyptian president will have it'll be interesting to see who else he meets beside President Trump, actually.
I'm just curious, in terms of the meeting between Sisi and Trump, do we have any sense of what President Trump might ask of the Egyptians? Do we have any ask out for them, or is this more sort of reaffirming the commitment of both governments to dealing with radical jihadists?
I think a lot of that. I think there is a concern on the Egyptians against those types of forces in Sinai. Certainly, Egypt, in a sense, has dealt with a sense of being a bit surrounded. You have had ISIS forces in Libya, although they have been on the run of late. And then you've had them ISIS-related or ISIS-inspired forces in the Sinai. This Egyptian regime does not countenance any sort of Islamic radical presence in the country. They are against the Muslim Brotherhood. The U.S., we should note, has talked about this new administration has talked about banning them, actually formally banning the Muslim Brotherhood. They've seemed to have stopped on that talk for now, because this is an organization that exists in many Arab countries, and that I think they heard from other Arab leaders this would create major problems. So, but I still think that's something that this will be discussed during the meeting. I think it'll be the president will want to hear Egypt's views about what are things looking like in the region right now. Where are there things that we should be doing? What is his view on the Syrian conflict, which the U.S. seems to be getting drawn in more and more heavily on? It'll be coming off of an Arab League summit, which looks to be, from social media coverage, to be another yawner. However,
well, I was going to say, most of the photos I saw showed various Arab dignitaries in various stages of sleep.
But it'll be a way for President Trump to get a sounding. He's actually had already several meetings with Arab leaders in his young administration, and including high-level Saudi officials have come through. Has been gotten off to a generally decent start with Middle Eastern allies so far. Jim, we're going to the anniversary segment of the podcast. This week, we've got two important dates to discuss. The first one is April 6th. It was in April 6, 1917, that Congress officially declared war on Germany. So it's 100 years since the United States entered the First World War. Then you have April 4th, as in April 4th, 1949, when the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. This established NATO. These are two very different events tied to two different world wars. Jim, let's make some connections.
Well, Bob, you're looking at two of the pivotal moments in the history of American foreign policy because they're turning points about America's commitment and involvement outside its borders. Let's look first at the centennial of America's entry into World War I. It's a remarkable episode in American history, which I don't think gets near the amount of attention that it should. Again, think of American foreign policy to the extent it existed for the first century the United States existed as a country. We were driven by, we might call the farewell address of George Washington. The United States was staying a part of the political travails of the old world. We did not want to be involved with them politically. We were happy to deal with them economically, wanted to trade, but wanted to be separated politically. Yet here you have in 1917, 3 years after the war began in Europe, the United States joins a war that President Woodrow Wilson said only months before during his presidential campaign he had every reason to stay out of. And so here you have a president who, this is only about a month after his presidency began. Remember, back then, presidents were inaugurated on March 4th. Changed his mind. He did with great reluctance. Woodrow Wilson did not want to enter the war. In some ways, he was behind the American public, which was very angry over attacks on American shipping. You may recall from high school history, the Zimmerman telegram, where the German foreign minister tried to cut a deal with the Mexican government that Mexico could invade the United States and that would help the Germans, and they would divide up the spoils later on. So you had a lot of public pressure to go ahead.
Sinking of the Lusitania?
Sinking of the Lusitania, which more than 1,200 people were killed, but 128 of them Americans. So all of this had built up. And again, there was a distinct part of the American public that was opposed to going to war with in Europe. Some because of their attachment to George Washington's advice. Many of them for ethnic reasons. They were German or they were Irish, and they didn't want to do anything that would aid the British because they were adversaries. And keep it in mind, at this time, you have the Easter Rising, where the Irish are trying to get out from under the yoke of the British. This is also a time the United States has a series of spats, fights with the Mexicans, the invasion of Veracruz in 1914. You have the pursuit of Pancho Villa in 1916. So there's a lot going on. But the United States had traditionally stayed apart. And here you have a president who finally makes a decision that the United States can't stay apart. I'll note one of the oddities of it. The president went to Congress on April 2nd to ask Congress to declare war on Germany. That morning, he went and played golf. Golf's how much presidents play golf's in the news a lot. I will just say that neither Barack Obama nor Donald Trump were the first presidents to be consumed with playing golf or to play a lot of golf. Woodrow Wilson did way back 100 years ago. And again, when the United States enters the war, that kicks off a whole series of events. One of the things that Wilson was very, very worried about was that we couldn't keep traditional American democracy and fight a war at the same time. He was concerned about the rise of illiberal tendencies. And indeed, that's what happened. One of the things that comes out of World War I is the Espionage Act. It's a crackdown on civil rights and a variety of other things. And I'll just note, just as a personal aside, I'm actually this weekend going up to Philadelphia because Philadelphia is hosting two really interesting exhibits related to World War I. One is at the National Museum of American Jewish History, which is a Smithsonian affiliate, and they have an exhibit on 1917, how 1 year changed the world. Among other things, they will have a decoded copy of the Zimmerman telegram. And this exhibit is in Philadelphia, I guess, through the middle of July. And then it's going to travel up to New York to be at the American Jewish Historical Society. The other thing is that the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, PAFA, is having the exhibit on World War I in American art. Because it's really interesting is when countries go to war, societies tend to get mobilized, and how people perceive the war often shows up in the art. And those are two really great exhibits that I'm looking forward to. But let's sort of go to the flip side of it and talk about NATO, because we go into World War I. We go reluctantly. The war ends in an American victory. President Woodrow Wilson has his vision of the League of Nations. That leads, it's encoded in the Treaty of Versailles. He comes back home after this big negotiating effort, and the United States Senate refuses to endorse the League of Nations. The United States, in some sense, recoils from it having sort of violated tradition of getting involved in Europe, and America begins to turn away. That obviously intensifies in the 1930s period. We look on its isolation as America just sort of hoped the war that was building up and eventually broke out in Europe would stay away from us. It didn't stay away from us. Pearl Harbor. And when you get to the late 1940s with the signing of the NATO Act as an American commitment to fundamentally reorient its approach to the world, where we, after World War I, it was, no, I don't think we want to continue this relationship. After World War II with NATO, it is, we believe it is in our strategic interests to be involved with Europe and to defend Europe. We're not doing this out of charity. This is because we calculate America's strategic interest depends on making sure no single country dominates the European landmass. Fundamental change.
Fundamental change for executive and legislative branch. They are behind this.
The country is behind it. The treaty passes overwhelmingly. And again, this takes us to the present day. Why talk about history? Because history is sort of a prelude to today. One of the things, obviously, with the Trump presidency is questioning the relevance of NATO. The president has said it over and over again. He's both concerned about whether it's focused on the right issues. He's concerned or expressed concern about whether the members of NATO are actually doing what they're supposed to do, or basically playing the United States for sucker. And again, Americans don't quite remember why it was that we created NATO. And NATO is, in many ways, a victim of its own success. You created a zone of peace that people in the 1940s and 1950s desperately wanted, weren't sure they could achieve. Now today, people are used to the peace and think it's sort of a natural thing. It's just a natural state of affairs.
Well, and it's also worthwhile looking at if you looked at a map of Europe in the 1940s in this period of NATO's creation, and you drew a line down, people I think would be surprised to see how much of Europe is in the red zone, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, West Germany is the front line, and there's this jagged line going down, and that's it. And the West is in the green zone.
Well, you know that from having covered and covered the news in Europe as the wall was coming down, and then of course we've now moved NATO further east, and that of course has led to considerable pushback from the Russians. We just this week the Senate voted to bring Montenegro
That's right.
into NATO.
29th country. 29th, 28th?
28th, I believe. But again, and that was an overwhelming vote, 97-2. Now, and bringing Montenegro into NATO doesn't substantially increase the military capacity of NATO. It doesn't really increase at all. Montenegro is a tiny country, but it is. By doing so, I think it's also a political statement about the desire to preserve this region as one that is peaceful, that gets along, that cooperates.
And it means most of the former Yugoslavia is in NATO or potentially on its way. Not Serbia, but still, it's significant symbolically.
Very much so. And the Russians were quite vocal that they believe that NATO should not be expanding. They view that as a hostile act. So that takes us again back to today and sort of what is the future of NATO? Do Americans see an interest? Do they define their interest the same way that Americans in the 1940s did? To what extent are Europeans interested in investing in NATO? We've talked a lot in this podcast about all of the pressures and divisions within Europe that are sort of pulling it apart, making it hard to get cooperative action. What are the Russians going to do in response? So, again, if you look back a century ago, the decision that Congress made was a monumental one, and likewise a decision made in 1949 about signing up to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was also pivotal. And I think in many ways today we are watching history unfold because we may be at what I guess mathematicians would call an inflection point. This is the point where maybe things will change and change significantly. So but only time will tell on that score.
It is worth noting that of all this talk of the other talk we've been focusing on in this podcast and elsewhere on Brexit and populism, it's been a sort of an economic question. You haven't heard so much how much it's affect NATO yet, but that's going to be worth watching. How long is Hungary going to stay in NATO, for example?
Yes, well, I think NATO has a number of divisions that could pull it apart. You mentioned Hungary. That's an obvious one. You have the division between the United States and other countries about whether or not they're investing sufficiently. And again, President Trump brings this attitude toward it that the NATO members should be paying the United States, providing its services. You have the issue of Turkey, which is at odds with much of Europe and increasingly trying to make common cause with the Russians. It's not clear that that's sustainable. But again, a lot of divisions within NATO, a lot of choices are going to be made. And again, we have elections coming up in Europe, depending upon what the outcome is in the French presidential elections, the German.
And the Turkish referendum.
There's just lots of things that could upend the apple cart. And we tend to think of the current state of things as the only way they can be. And then periodically, history reminds us that there are other ways things can be done. The last time we really had an upheaval, 1989 and 1991, when the Cold War ended. And we all thought, where some people, history was over. History's not over.
So a week soaked in history.
Bob, let's move on to our figures of the week, which can be an important number or person in the news today. Let's start off with our audience figure of the week. This week it comes from NJG773, whose Twitter handle is at NJG773. NJG773 offers up the number 1.8, as in every 1.8 days, there has been a drone strike under the Trump administration. This compares to a rate of one drone strike every 5.4 days during the Obama administration. So why is the number 1.8 significant, Bob?
Well, it's a revealing number in how this administration has sort of picked up from Obama administration practices and accelerated them on the counterterror front and certainly on the drone strike front. And we're talking about places like Yemen in particular. Although these drone strikes have been deployed in Syria and Somalia to some extent. I'm not sure actually the last time one was taken in Somalia. But drones are an easier way of maintaining action while not necessarily seeming intrusive. And I know that sounds weird, but when you have a sort of action like a SEAL team action that we talked about recently in Yemen, that is seen as more of a kind of a sovereign intruding act than something involving a drone strike, even though it's airspace over a country. Our colleague Mike Azenko has been tracking this actually probably more actively than anybody, and he's noted. He's
Mr. Drone.
He's Mr. Drone. He noted assiduously during the Obama administration how frequent they were deploying drone actions, and then saw very early on how the Trump administration has picked this up and accelerated it. So it's quite something. It's also gets into the issue of preemptive strikes and preemptive strikes against people who are seen as threats. It wasn't too long ago that this was something that was not approved U.S. policy. It's now taken for granted that if the U.S. identifies a threat, an individual seen as a threat, especially somebody belonging to an acknowledged terror group, whether it's Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, the U.S. will go and take its chances and try to knock that person out.
Yeah, you mentioned Micah doing a lot of work on this. Micah Zenko, his blog you can find on CFR.org. And one of the things Micah has been pointing out for quite some time is that sort of the development of drones allows the United States to use force against targets while minimizing sort of diplomatic fallout because you're not actually putting troops on the ground, and also minimizing risk to American military personnel because they're not going in. But what he has noted is that this technology is not sort of only available to the United States. It's increasingly spreading, and we have to worry about sort of the precedents that we're setting being emulated by others. And I'll note just recently I read a series of articles about how within the Defense Department they're realizing that other countries are going to get this technology. Indeed, individuals can get this. And then the question is, how do you deal with drone strikes against your own forces? And as drone technology gets smaller, the possibility you could have terrorist attacks, other kinds of attacks that could put American forces or American civilians at great risk. So there's a whole question of where is this technology going and how do you prepare for it and defend against it. But I think there's also the question, more in the immediate term, of the consequences of launching more drone strikes. What we have seen is more drone strikes. We've also seen more reports of missions that have led to civilian casualties, and what is the consequence, human, diplomatic, strategic, of that.
And our thanks to NJG773 for that figure of the week. Jim, how about you? What's your figure?
Bob, I'm going with a number, and I'm going to go with the number 50, as in Article 50, because this week British Prime Minister Theresa May pulled the lever and invoked Article 50, which begins the formal process of Great Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. So let's just say they've jumped off the bridge, and now the question is, can they stick the landing? And that's going to be very, very hard to do. You got 2 years to do this, and one of the mystifying things about the Prime Minister's decision is she's sort of start the clock running right now, but she's probably not going to have negotiating partners until the late fall. We have an election in France that will greatly influence the French voice on these issues. You're not going to have elections in Germany until the fall, which will really influence what kind of deal will be on the table. And again, I think that if you look in Britain, there's a range of opinion as to how well this is going to go. You have, I think, the people who really believe in Brexit arguing that all of this talk about how difficult the divorce will be is widely overstated, that at the end of the day, the European Union countries are going to look and say, Britain is actually important to us economically, so it's in our interest to have this be resolved amicably. And I think the pessimists look out, and I'm probably more in the pessimist camp, that the European Union has an incentive to make this painful for Britain because they don't want other countries leaving. When you add in the fact that a number of countries are unhappy with the British for leaving, and some nationalist impulses going on there, and then you take in the fact of how many national legislatures have to approve this, you have all kinds of opportunities for people to hold the Brexit agreement hostage. We saw that with the Canada-European Union Free Trade Agreement earlier, or last year, where that got sort of sidelined for quite a long way over, people in essence holding it hostage to get concessions from other members.
Held up by Flemish people in Belgium, I think.
Yes, it was the Wallonians. Wallonian Regional Parliament wanted some concessions for its consent. So I think this is going to be very difficult, and the question is whether or not the sort of political track and the economic track can match up. Because one of the things you obviously have is you have negotiators sitting down, trading proposals and the like, and there's some big issues there. I mean, an obvious one is how much does Britain have to pay to leave? Because Britain incurred a variety of obligations during its time as an EU member, and the question then becomes is how big is that number? And,
I've seen some pretty big estimates.
Yeah, we're talking like 60 billion.
60 billion.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. And then over what terms, over how long? Then there's all the questions about things ranging from access to airfields and air travel to what the trading agreements are going to be. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that will take a long time to deal with just because of complexity, let alone before you even factor in disagreements about what the right thing to do is. And the question is, on the economic front, are firms in Britain or thinking about being in Britain willing to be patient? Right? Because one of the things firms don't like is uncertainty. And what they tend to do in uncertainty is to sort of stand in place. But obviously, if you want your economy to grow, you want firms investing. You want them adding to factory capacity, not saying, well, we're going to sort of wait and see. So you could end up having some significant problems. Now, of course, the anti-Brexiteers have been predicting doom and gloom on the economic front in Britain for months now, and it hasn't happened yet. But the fact it hasn't happened doesn't mean that it won't happen. And then, of course, the other wild card is how this is going to play in the internal politics of the United Kingdom, which may be the disunited kingdom before everything is said and done. The Scottish Parliament has voted to hold a referendum on whether Scotland will sort of leave Great Britain, because most Scots want to stay in the EU. You got the whole problem of Northern Ireland. One of the things that's happened with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement a while back is that we've brought peace to Ireland, and there's a very open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But if Britain leaves the EU, Ireland's still in the EU, and a big part of this is about controlling migration, then you're going to have to reinstall a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. How does that work out? So we'll see how this plays out. But this is a very, very big deal by the British government. And after a lot of talk and lead up to it, now we're finally going to get to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, and our colleague Sebastian Malaby wrote in the Washington Post this week about sort of don't be fooled by the lull of the last 9 months. As this plays out, you're going to start seeing the pain points pretty clearly.
But what about you, Bob? Who or what is your figure of the week?
Jim, I've picked two people, actually, who've become well-known in the news this week.
I did two historical events. You can do two people.
Okay, I'll do two people. For tragic purposes, unfortunately. These are an American, Michael Sharp, and a Swede, Zaida Catalan, if I get the pronunciation right. Their bodies were found in the Congo after they'd been missing for a couple of weeks, and they were part of a group of experts commissioned by the UN to look into causes of violence in a town in sort of central eastern Congo. And what this does is, first of all, it's the first time in quite some time that you've had UN officials who have been victim of violence in Congo. Congo has been no stranger to violence. Certainly, if you look at the numbers, they're actually horrific over the last 10 to 15 years involved in especially in eastern Congo. Many people under arms, many ethnic grievances, and it's a vast country where the writ of the central government does not extend very far. These two were actually trying to they understood the country and were trying to get down to basics in terms of fact-finding. The American is especially mourned as someone who had been well-known in the community and well-liked, and was a victim of just what has been, unfortunately, an increasing sort of mounting violence.
Do we know who's responsible for it, or
it's not clear who? There are suspicion is falling on sort of the parties involved in the violence there, since these UN fact-finding missions tend to pull no punches in terms of pointing to who's culpable. So there could have been a number of sides responsible. There was a recent incident involving Congolese police officers. I think almost 50 of them were captured and beheaded. The only people who weren't were 6 of them who belonged to an ethnic group that shared ethnicity with the group of attackers. It gets down to that on a micro level in Congo. Right. And the Congolese government the UN is mounting its own investigation. They've asked the Congolese to mount theirs. But again, this is a country that doesn't have a lot of capacity in these regards and has been going through its own kind of painstaking effort to work out an agreement for holding elections, which were due at the end of last year, actually.
And well, Congo has had a very sad and very long history of violence of this sort, particularly in the eastern part of the country. Yeah,
I think it was the world's most violent in terms of deaths, sheer deaths over a 20 or so year period, something like 5 million. You know, it's minds tended to blur when you talk about the Congo because it's been so chronic there. Right. But in fact, people who know it well are worried about the latest trends because after a little bit of a pause, you're starting to see violence resume. And the fact that they would go after UN fact finders is an indication that the stakes are getting higher.
Very, very sad story.
And that's our look at the world next week. Here's some other stories to keep an eye on. Mexico and the EU resume trade talks. And Argentina hosts the World Economic Forum on Latin America.
Let us know how you feel about the world next week, or tweet us your figure of the week at CFR_org using hashtag TWNW. Also, be sure to subscribe to the world next week on iTunes. Please note that opinions expressed in the World Next Week are solely those of the hosts or our guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions. Today's program is produced by Kevin Lizarazo, with senior producer Jeremy Sherlick, recording engineer Jonathan Perry, and with special thanks to Audrey Bowler and Corey Cooper. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrero and licensed under Creative Commons. This is Jim Lindsay saying goodbye.
And this is Robert McMahon saying so long.